A lot of the small behaviors like the anger or a reaction, some kind of hypervigilance is a story, is a narrative. And so it's very powerful when that person is understood in their family or in their relationship, what is behind that behavior. Because on the surface, all we're seeing is the reaction, and that reaction brings up a lot of emotions, and it can bring up a lot of hurt to everybody else. But once there's a little bit more understanding from everybody else in the system, where that reaction is coming from, it can be very powerful, and it can be very, it can contribute to a lot of healing for the person who may experience PTSD, as well as those who are also being affected by it. So that was what I wanted to add to this.
And Kirsten just came back from a trip to Florida, to the carefully selected training site, where the training was specifically on couple counseling when one person in the relationship has PTSD. And I think you found that really enriching. That's
exactly where this is coming from. It really gave me just a lot of insight into what some of the things that I've seen over the short time of my career, but also that Nicole has shared with me in her time training me, I guess, yeah.
Thanks. Thanks so much. Maybe I can, I mean, as you can tell, we can probably talk for hours about this. And there was one thing that I did pick up when I was, all right, I'll talk into this, definitely giving me that eye. The one thing I did pick up was there were a couple of tears at one table in particular when I was mentioning about the one captain that I had in Dawson that was going to take his life. And again, we look at dispatchers, also WCB claims people are things that you have to deal with too, and you have to deal on a daily basis. So again, the encompassing and the education is when you get into the job, things that you can be dealing with and know that there's help out there. And there is. And I said 15 years ago, we'd never see people in a room that haven't fallen asleep in a lecture or something, and this is fantastic to see. So I'll open it up if there's any questions. Just if you ask a question, just I'll run around with this so that it can be taped.
One thing I just want to mention is you said, and that's an important thing, is that for post-traumatic stress, it's not just directly witnessing, right? You can be hearing about something. So if you're doing a lot of claims, or if you're working where you're like a court transcriber, like going through a murder trial, a serious sexual assault, they're exposed to traumatic material. So you're doing claim after claim for PTSD, and you're reading about all these traumatic events. Like, that's a piece of self-care too, because you don't actually have to see it. Hearing and knowing about it is also, and that's sort of changed in the new diagnostic manual where we're acknowledging that more, is you don't have to directly be there, but you can, it's a constant being inundated with traumatic material that can also contribute to this.
Hi. I think some of the stuff that came out yesterday and today, and one of the biggest parts that I heard was kind of paramount to dealing with this issue is peer support and peer support groups. So I guess my question to Jim, or anyone, what exists right now for peer support?
Well, in EMS, we're trying to put together peer support groups. We're trying to get all the supervisors through the training to be peer supports. But at the present moment, I think someone handed me a business card yesterday with peer support question mark on the back and told me to give her a call. So yeah, so what we're working towards it. But right now, in the last 5 years, we've developed, for all our new employees, we've developed education regarding PTSD or signs and symptoms, or how to recognize it in yourself and who to talk to. So we don't have a peer support system per se at present, but at least there is a pathway to follow now if you need to talk to somebody.
And I think for some organizations, some people haven't been a fan of the peer support, and I think some people haven't, depending on where your feelings are at for the organization that you work for. So I think what I've seen is a lot of inherent distrust for systems as people have gone through them, so they don't want to come to another person in the system. So in saying that, I think there's a lot of informal peer support that goes along with some jobs, like getting together, RCP, you know, after your shifts, and just talking through the calls. And actually, I find it interesting because over time, when I've looked at people's careers, like for example, with RCP and where they've been connected to somebody, other members that they really got along with, the symptoms weren't as present as when they felt more isolated. And I'm like, okay, it's those informal debriefings, the barbecues, the driving back in a car and saying, oh my God, what was that? That was, I've never experienced that, versus being in a rural area and getting in a car and driving back by yourself. And after 2-3 years of that, you haven't talked to anybody, but not recognizing that. So I think the peer support is a good option for people to have in place, but I think we also have to recognize it's not going to work for everybody. Some people want to come to a confidential space, know it's going to be there, stay there, and that's it. And they don't necessarily trust the other models, but I think it does work in some cases.
And I think I'll go back to my Winston Churchill pile driver. There's virtually, it's non-existent. I know in the fire service in the sense that I think there's a lot of people working in different silos trying to get things together. It's nice to see on a federal level a national action plan. Obviously provinces and territories have to work and put something together, but it's we're discussing it, but there really isn't anything that has teeth to it. And I think yesterday, for those who were in the room when that question did come up, the glaze looked in everyone's eyes, kind of going, okay, peer support. Who do we go to? So yeah.
So looking at it organizationally, I mean, we as the Yukon Employees Union represent a great number of the people that potentially could be affected. So I guess in a perfect world, as an organization or as an employer, or what part can we play in supporting peer support?
It would be great to have a full-time psychologist on staff for EMS. Honestly, it would be. It would be great to interview people as they start their career. It would destigmatize the stigma around going to see a psychologist or a counselor. You have routine check-ins. Of course, you can't force anyone, but at least say, you know what, here's your half an hour with the counselor. It's your yearly checkup. And that person is available, and their course load is, maybe not just EMS, but emergency services, someone who specializes in that field. That would be great. That's just an idea off the top of my head, though. I've been thinking about it.
Yeah, and I know a long time ago when I used to work for Barb Nimco and she still had the EAP contract, she was really wanting. And again, I know we're talking about EMS, but wanted to have some more unlimited EAP. I would love, as a therapist, to be able to have the option of going to our EAP provider and saying, this person's, and identifying PTSD or exposure to a major traumatic incident at the workplace, and have a pot of funds that we can apply to say, okay, I need an extra 6 hours for this person. And I think that would be helpful because it's something that we can do. And again, when we talk about empowering, like, we try and involve our clients as least as possible in this stuff that we have to deal with to get more stuff, right? Because we just want them to do their work and stay focused on that. But we don't have that option with the EAP provider that we have, but that certainly would be a way that we could work with that.
All right, I don't have a question, it's more of a statement. And Steve, I really wanted to thank you for putting this on. This is great, because one of the main things that has to happen as a community is getting rid of the stigma of mental injury. And I'm not just talking about PTSD. I mean, there are a lot of other mental injuries that need to be taken into consideration. And great to hear you talk about the prevention, because that's in my wheelhouse. So Jim, I'm really glad to hear about that. But Devin, what you started to describe there is essentially what's needed in upfront prevention in order to make sure that people aren't suffering from the work that they do. So
Baseline, yeah.
yeah, that is a baseline, and I really think that it's something that we need to look at as a community going forward. How do we put those preventive measures in place so that we're not dealing with the mental injury down the road? You know, a presumption in my mind is if that's all we're relying on, we've missed the boat. So to the point you made earlier, so I'm really glad to hear that that type of sort of a dialogue within your services. Because if we're only relying on sort of the medical interventions after the fact, then we're not doing a good enough job as a community.
Wholeheartedly concur. And one of the things to recognize here is that police, fire, EMS, dispatchers, nurses, you will have some sort of mental injury at some point. It's just a matter of the degree and the supports you have and the education you have to deal with it, and maybe the personal fortitude to a certain extent. I was talking with a bunch of colleagues last night, and not one of them could say that they haven't been affected by a post-traumatic injury at some point. You would be hard-pressed to find someone who's been doing this for longer than 5-10 years who can look you in the eye and say they've never been affected by the trauma that they've been exposed to in the line of duty.
And then that speaks to that grief piece I was talking about the changes in yourself, right? Like the more, like I always say, once you go through the door, you can't pretend you didn't see what's on the other side anymore. Like it changes you. And so how do you incorporate that into being a healthy person moving forward? But it's going to be part of who you are, right? But it doesn't have to stop you, because one of the other hallmarks of PTSD is impairments in functioning, social, occupational, relational, right? We want to make sure that those are as minimal as possible, but also this is why people that are exposed to trauma stick with each other, right? Because you're like, oh, our brains all kind of work the same, right?
And our humor is
the humor's the same, right? And you know, I've done a lot of work with sexual abuse. I hear sleepovers when my kids come home. I don't go, oh, great. I have a whole list of disasters that, like, it's changed me. Right? I don't see things the same way anymore. But part of that is knowing that and being like, okay, that's my first thought, but what's the reality, and being able to adopt a thought process around understanding where do these thoughts come from, and you know, you can't sit in a glass house, but acknowledging that I do know these things happen. I do know that people get hurt in a car when they don't have a seatbelt on, so of course I freak out on something. You know, whatever you're coming to the table with, but it's but it will change you, and I think people need some support in that, and that's where we try and really lean on the brain education. We found that super effective with first responders and people that have experienced trauma, because when you really look at the biological changes that have to take place in order to be exposed to trauma, it kind of makes you feel like not like you're able to kind of understand that something has really happened here, and then you have the education to know how to deal with it to move on.
One more question. We'll probably take a couple more questions, and then we'll wrap it up. And if you do have questions, please, and I'm going to put Steve on the spot, maybe you can fire the questions off to him, and then he can just fire them off accordingly to, because we definitely, there's probably some people with questions, but you, in this forum, sometimes people don't want to ask questions, but if you have them, please email them, and we'll definitely, we'll get back to you on it. So question back here.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for coming. My question is academic. I wondered if you could describe by way of contrast what is normal versus what is PTSD.
what is like a normal response to a situation.
With a normal person versus somebody who deals with PTSD.
Yeah, so one of the things that we really met, so there's in the DSM-5, the diagnostic manual, there's a whole list of criteria. And one of the hallmarks though is that we're looking for change, the change in functioning of social, because when you experience a traumatic event, your brain does need time to process. So we usually use that, there's a 72-hour window where you're probably not going to sleep, eat. There's some normal stuff that's happening. We really want to know the difference between what's a normal response. Like for somebody to see a deceased person or a severe sexual assault, it's going to take time to process. That doesn't mean you have PTSD. Up to 30 days is what we call acute stress, which means that you've been exposed to something and your brain is trying to figure out what to do with it, right? If it persists past 30 days and we start to see impairments of functioning, and that includes like, it's basically a lot of intrusiveness in your life, intrusive thoughts, intrusive feelings, like negative cognitions, like the whole world is bad, or every time I get in a car I'm gonna get in an accident, or, so it's the changes in thinking, the way you're processing information, like distraction, irritability, but we're also looking for, I'm having a hard time getting out of bed to go to work, I'm having a hard time not blowing up, so we assess according to the diagnostic manual to see if past 30 days, that person has not adjusted. Because really something has happened and your system needs to adjust. But it is the impairment piece that, along with the other cluster of symptoms, that makes the difference. The thing though about PTSD is that it all depends on, like for me seeing a deceased person, I might be completely overwhelmed versus somebody else who's had more exposure to it. So I might get PTSD from that, and somebody might go, oh my God, I've seen it's all relative to what your normal experiences are. And that's the thing with first responders. Pattern repetitive exposure to abnormal experiences, they get used to it. So that changes you. I might not respond the same way if I see a car accident. So it's very individualistic, and that's the important piece. Is to not measure your experience against somebody else's, but we're looking for that cluster of symptoms that's in the diagnostic manual.
And if I may press the academic issue a little bit more, could you distinguish between PTSD and complex PTSD, CPTSD?
I don't know if that's really like the diagnostic manual just focuses on PTSD, and then we look at what level of impairment it is. So really that's how we would describe it, like in an assessment and report. But there's a difference between witnessing one event and having to process it, and then more complicated things like a career of 20 years of seeing multiple things, and maybe we have to differentiate between if it's a delayed onset, because some people can work for 15 years and not experience it, and then all of a sudden, like I said, one more thing happens. And that's complex because we've got to unpack all the other stuff.
I don't know if this is academic or not, but just for me, you know, going to a young child who was deceased early on in my career was bearable. I know it sounds horrible, but then after I had kids, that same call affected me very differently. So I think it all depends on what stage you might be at. You know, I don't know.
And what else might be going on in your life?
So there's a lot of factors, I think.
Yeah. Like if you're already like maybe having some other challenges in life, and then you have a traumatic event, or maybe you've had multiple losses through your job, whether that's you're working in palliative care, and all of a sudden maybe it's somebody you had a closer relationship to, or maybe you've just lost your grandmother 3 months ago, and then and then it kind of just the cup spills over. It's kind of like a really mixed pot.
Yeah, we'll take one more and then.
I think people figured it out. With most medical diagnoses, there needs to be a certain threshold or bar that has to be met before support systems can kick in. For PTSD, what kind of things need to change systemically in Yukon for burden of proof. So before someone meets that threshold before those sorts of support services are available, if you could wish list the things that need to be changed, what would be at the top of those lists?
You think, may I jump in there?
Yeah.
No, I'm just trying.
I like wish lists.
I like wish lists, yeah, it's a good time of year. For me, I think we have to shift the onus from the employee to the employer, and that happens a lot because we get into, okay, when you're at the point where you're going for help for post-traumatic stress, you don't have the reserves to be fighting or paying for bills that which I helped my member out with who couldn't afford his medication and everything like that. And I think years ago, when I first got to Dawson, of course, I walked in and wow, okay, I'm the president of the Association of Yukon Fire Chiefs, we're going to make changes, Yukon-wide 911, which is great. But I was very defensive, and I think the onus has to shift, but also we have to work out of our silos and work together so that we can move those things forward and educate people to say, hey, these mechanisms are in place. I know, and Kurt can probably attest to it too, like I said before, a lot of times it's easy to point the fingers either at, as Kurt is the president, or it's always easy to go to the minister who's now at Genie and point the finger there. But we have a responsibility too, but for me, it is really shifting the onus from the employee to the employer, but done in the right manner, and just so that if someone goes in and sees a doctor, says, you know, I think you're dealing with this. However, there's that long gap, which it can be, to actually see a psychologist, to be diagnosed. Hopefully, not hopefully, but you will be covered. And go ahead, Kurt.
Okay, I just wanted to jump in on this as well, because it shouldn't get to that point where you've got to go and, you know, get the diagnosis and fight for it. If there are things in place like critical stress or critical incident stress debriefings in place in workplaces, so that if something happens, there's early intervention, that can make a huge difference in the outcomes. We as an organization have recognized that, and where there's been a fatality in a workplace, for example, we will send people in to provide that. Even though there are no claims for compensation, there's nothing with any of the staff members there, we know that if we get in there soon enough and can offer some help and at least direct them to be going somewhere early on, the chances of it developing into a mental injury are greatly reduced. Now, it doesn't always prevent it, but it makes a big, big difference to those people in the workplace. So those are the types of things that, like Jim's absolutely correct. It's got to be intervention within the workplace very early on, and that takes a partnership between the employer and the workers to set those systems up and to have those conversations internally that normalize seeking help. That's a big piece of it. You've got to normalize those help-seeking behaviors, because if we don't, then we are going to continue down a bad road. We just will.
So if you're going to send a team in, per se, into a workplace because there was an injury or a death, what about occupations that see death daily?
That has to be, see, when it's, those systems, support systems have to be in those workplaces. Like, they have to be within the workplace. Where it's a single incident occurs, it's easier to respond to a single incident, but where it's something that occurs on a regular basis, then that has to be built into the work environment. It really does. There's no other way to deal with it.
Yeah.
Thanks, and all. Sorry, we are short on time, and not that I want to. Everyone's comments are huge.
So one of the, okay, my wish list is, I can't believe the stuff that happens in this community that never gets debriefed. Like, I'm blown away by that. So we need to be able to identify what needs to be debriefed. Like, yeah. And one of the things when I worked in Alberta that was awesome, and we did it when I worked at mental health and for a nonprofit, is we had a critical incident phone contract. So we would hold the phone, and we had money from the province for that, and so we had to have all that training. So if there was kids involved, how would we debrief kids? Because there's a specific training for kids. We would decide, is it a defusing? Is it what is it? Because it has to be set up properly. So we would have the training, we would have the money to have the phone so that we could execute stuff. I get phone calls from EAP and they're like, hey, can you go to Watson Lake? I'm like, no, because we're booked, right? So we can't respond because it's not built into anything that we're doing and we're already busy. So, and because we work for ourselves, we can't wait for something to happen for us to, so we don't have anything built in terms of time. I've talked to Veteran Affairs about how it would be great to be able to have an occupational stress clinic here. One of the things I hear from veterans is they're like, I'm going to the hospital to go to a support group. I don't want to go to a hospital for a support group. There's a lot of little things that we could be doing that don't, like, because that feels medical model. So where do we get together where people, like just thinking through some of those things, how we do forms, how can we respond? Because I feel bad when we can't run to a critical incident debrief and help people because it's just not built in. So if there was concentrated funds for that, that would be great. Support groups would be great. But some of this involves funding, right? And so it's gotta be a priority. And we used to have a walking clinic day in Alberta. So when when the whole oil boom happened and nobody had any space to do anything, we created a walking clinic from noon till 8. And we prioritized stuff so that people could come in and just get something and we'd be connecting them. We don't have anything like that, so people wait. Or we come in on the weekends and we see people because we don't want them to wait, we can hear the urgency, and then we gotta take care of ourselves too. So there are some things that we could be doing, but they do involve dollars, expertise, and dedication.
Well, let's hope with the National Action Plan that will be coming out from the federal government that we can tap into that, and I think hopefully these discussions are our premiers in Ottawa right now, and it's nice that he's got the ear of our Prime Minister. Devin, some final?
No, thanks for coming out. It's great. I would have never seen this 15 years ago, even 10 years ago, something like this. And I wholeheartedly agree with you that the value for dollar is in prevention. The goal is to, basically what we're doing here is, across Canada, first responders are killing themselves. The goal is to stop that from happening. The goal is to stop it from getting to the point where you can no longer perform your task, your job. So yeah, an ounce of prevention is a pound of cure.
Thanks, everyone. I don't want to put Jeannie on the spot, but I'm going to. Thanks so much for coming. Do you have any thoughts, any closing thoughts, any?
I have lots of thoughts about this. I do.
Yeah.
I think that what a fantastic discussion to have. I can already see how we'll link with other departments like health. We have a mental wellness strategy that's underway. We can put supports in there. There's no reason not to. I really believe in prevention as well, but taking care of people who are injured. I come from a community, my background is in community development, community justice, mental health, and I've dealt right at the front lines of crisis in the communities in Cleveland for the past 8 years. So I've led a lot of work in that community. I know that there are a lot of things we can be doing more in a more efficient way as well, using the resources that we have and partnering with other agencies, other governments. So I really thank you for the session today and everybody who put this on, because this is a huge priority for our government, and we intend to meet the commitment that we made. So I'm happy to be here. I'm happy to have this file to work on.
thank you so much, everyone, for coming. And I know from the federal level, I also sit on the Canadian Association of Fire Chiefs as a director, and we've been promoting through Health Canada, Commission of Health Canada, Road to Mental Readiness. Everything's out there. We just have to kind of massage something that works best for us. And we want people like yourselves, and like all of us, we come in the door, we don't want your brains left outside. We want you to come in and be fully operational. The odd time I do that. But thanks so much. And please, a great round of applause for